I wanted to give a little bit of a preface about this particular slide going up, because there is a word contained in this slide that might be a little incendiary. But that's what she called the book. So we're going to go. My name is Joaquin Munoz, and I teach at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm part of the elementary education program. And my responsibility is in working with teacher candidates, generally first and second year students. And this is a little story about the process I went through in an attempt to indigenize my Minnesota American Indians classroom. So when I teach Minnesota American Indian standards in my teacher education program, I use young adult and children's literature. Many of my students are overwhelmed with the theory that's brought into these courses, and I needed to find a way to make this material more accessible to them. And related to this challenge was also trying to bring material to my students that they actually wanted to read. My students are really clever about finding ways not to read assignments, and so I wanted to bring them things that they would be excited to read about. Underneath all of this, though, is a challenge that every person of color and every Indigenous person faces, both as educators but also on a daily basis. It's fueled by a desire to be viewed as human, to be seen as actual people. And for my courses, which have well over 75% white students, many of whom are from rural areas, the need to humanize the people that I talk about is paramount. So in the developing of this course material, I started with a few different pieces, and some of these are listed up on this slide. And one of the main ones came out of work with a friend of mine who is a critical feminist named Kate Domusio, who wrote a book back in the early 1990s called A Declaration of Independence. And she challenged me when she gave me this book to say, I want you to try and go one full year without reading anything unless it's been written by a woman or by a femme-identified trans woman. And I tried it, and I do this on a regular basis. So as I began to construct this course, I took her ideas and blended them with the ideas of a few other people who I have a deep respect for. Debbie Reese, who many of you may be familiar with, and her website, American Indians in Children's Literature. The Culturally Responsive Curriculum Scorecard developed by NYU, which gives a wonderful way to go through your text and materials to determine characters, to determine authors, to determine the cultural responsiveness of the text that you're using. And then a couple of other materials that have helped me determine which text I could use. So as you can see, taking all that, and then going through this mental process here, I came to the text that I ended up using in my class. And just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with the Birch House? How many of you are familiar with Fatty Legs? How many of you are familiar with the Marrow Thieves? Okay. Yes. So along with using this scholarship and thinking about how all of these things played into text and materials that I selected, the one thing that I was most really trying to accomplish was something that Debbie Reese challenges folks on, and it's this idea of narratives against what she refers to as TV Indians. Native folks that come through the portrayals that we see when we open up George and Martha books and we see George wearing an Indian headdress. Clifford the friendly red dog going to Halloween wearing a headdress and carrying what looks sort of like a peace pipe of some sort. This idea that we are trying to move toward an informed environment within children's literature that displaces stereotypes and erroneous ideas that many people know about who Indigenous people are. That's directed from Reese. So each of the featured books, The Birch House, Fatty Legs, and The Marrow Thieves, is written by an Indigenous woman. They are folks that are Indigenous to the communities that they are writing about. And they do exactly what Debbie Reese challenges us to do as teachers and teacher educators, which is selecting texts that do things that push against the common narrative of what people understand about who Indigenous people are. There's one picture that I didn't put on here that I wanted to have on here, which was a picture of a little house on the prairie with a great big giant red X over it. And I'm going to be using that as my archetypal sort of comparison piece. So in the Birch House, we learn the adventures and the life of Machias and her family. And the action of the story takes place after the arrival of European colonizers. The encroachment of white people onto Anishinaabe land is in the background, but the story is largely told through the lens of the Indigenous eye. Indigenous folks are constantly being centered as the cultural focus. So if we borrow from Reese's frame about examining Indigenous frameworks, the Birch Bark House tells a really, really powerful story about Indigenous people. Our first encounter with an Indigenous person in this story is the central character, Old Tallow, an old Indigenous woman who is characterized as being courageous, as being afraid of nothing. And in Omakayas, we're introduced to a character who's referred to as a thoughtful girl with shining brown eyes and a wide grin. Already, pictures that are implanted in our mind that are starting to work against the narratives that we're often taught about who Indigenous peoples are. And if you ever want to have an interesting experience, take an old copy of Little House on the Prairie and open up to one of the depictions of Native folks, open up the Birch Bark House and compare those pictures side by side. You'll have a totally different experience of who Indigenous people are. Borrowing from Don Quigley's work about listening and storying, we also recognize that in the Birch Bark House, the language that the folks use there speaks directly against the so-called Tonto style of speaking. I don't even have to repeat it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In Fatty Legs, the Jordan Fenton and Pokiak Fenton's work, is called Fatty Legs, A True Story. It's the story of Oleman Pokiak, who eventually received the Christian name Margaret, and her time in a Catholic boarding school in the Northwest Territories. Margaret, while she's in her school, is taught how to read and write the English language, and she's called Fatty Legs because in an attempt to shame her, a nun who was known as the Raven gave her a pair of overly sized red woolly socks. And there's a really clever story about how Oleman goes about getting her revenge on the Raven. In this story, Fenton recalls the pain of losing her clothing, her hair, her language, her ties to her family and to other Indigenous people while at school, which voices a painful reality that many Indigenous people are familiar with. Like the Birch Bark House, Fatty Leg contains a number of very powerful images, both illustrations and photographs. And again, even with the cover, the reader immediately encounters an image that runs counter to our conception of what Indigenous people are and what they tend to look like. Now, granted, this is a depiction of Indigenous folks at a boarding school, but what it does is it gives us a contemporaneous view of who Indigenous peoples are. This is historical, but it's not the history we're sort of anticipating with folks wearing little to no clothing with feathers in their hair and standing with their arms crossed, as is depicted quite frequently in Little House on the Prairie. Another thing to note about Fatty Legs in this depiction, Margaret Oleman continuously refers to her Inuit community. The Indigenous people in this book are not anonymous Indians or Native Americans. They are situated within a particular place at a particular time and to a particular context, which is extremely important to get beyond the discourse that often tells us about, we're teaching, it's Native American History Month, and all Native people have the same kind of identity. This is also, Fatty Legs is also an excellent entry point for my students, again, who have difficult times understanding the history of Indigenous people in schools, is an entry point into some of the more painful depictions of boarding school experiences, like the one found in Uneducation, as well as The Outside Circle. Finally, we come to the Marrow Thieves, which when I teach this book, I always tell my students, I don't really care if you like the books that I'm bringing to you, I want you to read them. And then I go, except the Marrow Thieves, I really want you to like the Marrow Thieves. How many of you have read it again, just out of curiosity? I've read this book 6 times in the last 6 semesters, once a semester. I know how the book ends. It doesn't change, nothing happens to it. It ends the same way every single time. And every single time I have the exact same visceral emotional response. So if you haven't read it, go buy it, that's your own. Dibbeline's world presents a future of indigeneity, a future where Indigenous characters are at the forefront rather than as a side characteristic. The Marrow Thieves offers a process of eroding conceptions of time and representation as the story operates on the presumption that Indigenous people are now part of the future. It's a futuristic dystopia. Everything has deteriorated, there's no natural resources, and the Indigenous folks who are left are constantly moving north in an attempt to escape from the boarding schools. The Marrow Thieves speaks directly to what another favorite author of mine, the Afrofuturist N.K. Jemisin, voices in saying how terrified she was when she realized that nobody thought her people were a part of the future. So from a teacher-educator perspective, the Marrow Thieves accomplishes a number of helpful objectives. It offers the idea that Indigenous folks are in the future. They survive, their families survive, their communities survive, their language survives. And it's not just that, again, once we encounter all of these different characters who remind us that their place and their context are key and significant. The final piece about the Marrow Thieves that I think is probably the most critical is that it also offers us a future look into the experience of Native folks within the context of a global climate, a global political structure. And climate change and some other cataclysms figure prominently in how this story unfolds. But we see Indigenous folks in the future as the heroes, teaching their culture, teaching their language, and working to support the young people who still survive. So I'll close by saying that the use of young adult fiction, while being a leveraging point for students in order to get beyond some of their trauma about trying to deal with theory and trying to deal with some of the heavy-hitting topics that we have here, is that the students are engaged. The students are deeply committed to understanding the text that we're reading. And borrowing from Dr. Brian Brayboy's conception that stories are theory, with these students reading these stories and understanding the context where they come from, they do have a unique opportunity to engage Indigenous theory in a way that's accessible to them and in a way that's friendly to the levels that they operate in. Thanks.